50 years ago in 1971, Kamen Rider, or Masked Rider as it's sometimes translated, would become a huge success, but not one without periods of rocky history, as throughout the 1980s and 90s, there would only be a couple of series aired compared to the modern era of Kamen Rider that has seen a new series begin every single year since 2000. Its longest stretch of continued programming in its entire run so far, the Kamen Rider series sees no end in sight. Around the same time as the start of this franchise is when the Super Sentai franchise began as well, eventually being brought over to the United States by Hayao Saban in 1993 as Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. With the success that was this attempt at adapting the Toei property, the company tried it again in 1995 with Masked Rider, an adaptation of the 1989 series Kamen Rider Black RX. This was overall a huge failure, and Saban Entertainment or Saban Brands never made a solid effort of trying this approach for the Kamen Rider franchise ever again. But this wasn't the end for Kamen Rider in the States. Now that Kamen Rider was back in the 2000s with new shows, it was inevitable that someone would try again with a more recent series. The next attempt at an American adaptation would come to pass in 2008, when it was announced that Adness Entertainment had licensed the 2002 series Kamen Rider Ryuki to air on the CW's 4Kids television block starting in 2009, under the name of Kamen Rider Dragon Knight. Saban had no involvement this time, but Bandai America, who were known for their Power Rangers toy lines as well as the original Masked Rider toy line, would be involved for this new series. Dragon Knight would premiere at the end of 2008, without toys on the shelves to begin with, but that was where New York Toy Fair 2009 would come in, as Bandai's big debut for Dragon Knight toys. Compared to the typical Power Rangers style toy line or even a Japanese Kamen Rider toy line, the overall offerings would be rather light, hitting on the main staple items that needed to be there, while also adding that Bandai America touch of originality to it. Of course, that meant that there was a henshin belt as one of the main roleplay items, known as the Advent Belt. The original Ryuki version from 2002 of this toy included the decks for Kamen Rider Ryuki and Kamen Rider Knight, while the other decks for the other riders were released throughout the line in multiple weapons and special sets. In the Ryuki toy line, each rider got a unique deck for their design to use in the belt. For Dragon Knight, there was a different approach. Bandai was only going to sell one deck with this initial toy, instead opting to include swappable double-sided cards that featured most of the riders seen in the show, though some were missing. These decks could still hold cards, however the decks could not be fully opened like the Ryuki ones. Instead, the cards were inserted by pushing down on a spring mechanism and being slid in. The design of the belt stayed faithful to the original Ryuki V-buckle for the most part, but the decks would not be able to be slid in as seen in that series. In Dragon Knight, the decks would be seen spinning during their transformation sequence, an effect recreated with a button that would spin the deck when pushed down, then positioned to stop facing forward with a push of the button on the top of the belt. The only other roleplay item released was the Drag Visor, Dragon Knight's main device used to summon other weapons. This one could read the cards that came with each of the figures on the line, and be followed by a sound using the button on the nose of the dragon, but with a new American voice used for a total of 15 possible sounds unlocked using the notch patterns punched out at the top of each card. This was the only one of the two roleplay items to release with cards, those being Dragon Knight's Final Vent, Wind Knight's Trick Vent, and Axe's Freeze Vent. Both of these items retailed for $24.99 and were the most expensive items for the line. The rest of the Dragon Knight toy line was all about the action figures and what they could do. But before we cover Bandai's main 4-inch figure line of offerings, we'll cover the biggest figures released. For $19.99, Bandai came out with two 6.5-inch figures of Kamen Rider Dragon Knight and Wind Knight. Each of these featured hands that were molded with their Advent decks being held, which created this funny effect of the deck being seen in their hand and belt at the same time. Their helmets could be lifted up in a more traditional Knight style to reveal Kit and Len likenesses underneath them. Though one of the main draws to why fans might have wanted these figures were the cards. Included with each of them were their Final Vent cards. And while Dragon Knights had already been released with the Drag Visor, this figure release was the only way to get the one for Wind Knight, though they would both make the same sound in the Drag Visor toy. Everything else for Dragon Knight's figure line focused around the 4-inch figures. There were a few vehicles released for these figures, one being the Dual Rider bike set. These were simpler versions of the Deluxe motorcycles released that sported translucent plastic sitting posed figures and a battle damage design to both of the bikes. For the card, this time it was Spear's Spin Vent. If you wanted better detailed versions of these bikes, that's where the Dragon and Wing cycles came into play. These items were classic Bandai America creations, and in a lot of Power Rangers seasons, they would certainly be the Toyline exclusive items. However, these actually were built and used in the new footage shot for the show, as a way to add more vehicles into the series than just the standard ones seen in Ryuki. While the spin vent card was a strange choice to include with the dual rider set, here the choice was more appropriate, as each of these releases came with that rider's Survive Mode card, the only release of Survive Mode merchandise released in the Dragon Knight toy line. The final bike release was the Advent Cycle. This was the one from Ryuki. Keeping with the other card theme of the other cycles, the card included for this release was the Middle Mode Survive card, that completed the bird design of all three cards. There was one unreleased bike that did not appear in the series, however, as the cycle for Kamen Rider Strike, that followed in the same style as the other two we covered earlier, was seen in a promotional pamphlet in the Kamen Rider Dragon Knight Wii game. Just as the Strike cycle was never released, it's possible that there were two more bikes that were in the planning stages that never saw the light of day either. Designs on the portfolio of toy designer Jacqueline Varner shows the Drag Racer, which appears to be inspired in some parts by the Survive mode of Drag Redder when he turns into a bike, which would have included the Strike vent piece for the 4-inch figure, and another design in this portfolio shows the Torque Racer, that would have been able to transform into a Battleizer type armor for Kamen Rider Torque. Not much information is known about these besides what's seen on this portfolio, so it's unknown exactly how legitimate they are or how far in development they ever got. Before the Kamen Riders would transform, they would of course just be normal guys, and that was something Bandai was willing to make this time around as well. In a move to get some of the monster figures out there, they were packed in 3 deluxe figure sets that included a monster and a civilian rider. Each of the human figures were the same body mold, with the shirt painted the color of each rider, each wearing their advent belts, and the only unique pieces being a new head. You had Kit with Drag Rider, Len with Blackwing, and Drew with Magnu Giga. Similar to what was seen with the show, parts of the monsters could become weapons for the main series of 4-inch figures, with Drag Rider giving you the Sword Vent and Strike Vent weapons, Blackwing the Sword Vent and Guard Vent, and Magnu Giga the Final Vent and Strike Vent. Of course, each of these came with cards as well. While researching this video, I did stumble upon a photo for an unreleased 4th set in this line that was going to belong to Kamen Rider Strike. Instead of including a figure for James, it would have included a translucent purple version of his original 4-inch figure, but this would have been a way to get the Sword Vent weapon for the figure. And speaking of those figures, this finally brings us to the 4-inch figure line itself. Kamen Rider Ryuki and Kamen Rider Dragon Knight were known for their large selection of Kamen Riders to pick from. Sadly, the Dragon Knight toy line would never get around to releasing a handful of them, with some of them being cancelled or seeing extremely limited releases that are hard to track down. The main ones that were all over the place were the major riders in the series. Kamen Rider Dragon Knight of course got one, which featured his Sword Vent weapon and card. Kamen Rider Blank Knight also got a release, featuring his basic sword weapon and the Copy Vent card. Wayne Knight included his Visor Sword and the Nasty Vent card. Kamen Rider Torque included his gun and the Shoot Vent card. Kamen Rider Incisor had his Visor, Guard Vent weapon, and Strike Vent card. Kamen Rider Sting came with his Visor and the Swing Vent card. Kamen Rider Strike would have his Visor and the Confined Vent card. And finally, Kamen Rider Camo had his Hold Vent weapon and Advent Bio Griza card. These were all of the figures that ended up getting released at mass retail, but that was not all there ended up being. A figure for the main villain of the series, Xaviax, was seen in the same Wii game advertisement, but he never saw a release in the US. A figure for Kamen Rider Wrath did get a release in Europe, with his figure including his Staff Visor and Sword Vent card, and the Xaviax figure was also spotted in stores in Europe alongside Wrath and possibly Kamen Rider Thrust. While there are pictures of a figure for Kamen Rider Thrust that included his Strike Vent, he's in the same category as Xaviax and Wrath, who either did not get a release or saw a very limited window release in Europe. Right after Christmas 2009, it was announced that Kamen Rider Dragon Knight was cancelled. After only airing 38 of its 40 episodes, the final 2 were released online later on. By early 2010, Bandai America had cancelled the toy line and continued to focus on Power Rangers. Despite its lack of huge success in the US, Dragon Knight is looked back at fondly by a lot of tokusatsu fans, especially with actor Stephen Ford, who played the main character Kit, as he is quite active on Twitter and currently working on a number of independent projects. Dragon Knight would be pretty popular in Japan, however, receiving a Blu-ray release, a sequel novel, and Figma figure releases for all the riders seen in the series, predating the SH figure art releases from Ryuki by a couple of years. There were even Kubrick figures and statues made for the series as well. Bandai America was never given the opportunity to bring another Kamen Rider original toy line over to the United States. Today, the primary focus to groups such as Team Kamen Rider and Bluefin brands is to just bring over the original Kamen Rider series with subtitles and imported releases rather than trying to make a new adaptation, thus making Dragon Knight one of the last of its kind in the 90s practice of bringing over tokusatsu properties and making their own show. And at least we can say that they fought the fight. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Toku Toylines. The day this video will be going out, it will be Thanksgiving in the US, so happy Thanksgiving to all those who celebrate it. Hopefully you aren't stressing out too much over all of the cooking. I also picked this topic for this month since you can now watch the entirety of Dragon Knight's original series, Kamen Rider Ryuki, over on Shout Factory TV's tokuSHOUTsu channel, which I will be linking below. Until next time, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this short-lived toy line. Did you collect any of these items? Did you watch the show? Or did you get anything to be a stand-in for the original Ryuki toys? Be sure to follow me on Twitter at LivingRangerKey or at LightningFigPR, and until next time, let's ride!